Hi everyone, welcome. We're just waiting for a few more people to join, and we'll start in approximately 1 minute. While we wait, I'll just let you know that we will be recording the meeting or recording the presentation. So I just wanted to let everyone know. And while we wait, I invite you to introduce yourself to each other in the chat and just take a moment to say hello to each other.
Oh, good evening. This is Barb Bike calling. I mean, not calling, but listening in and participating. I'm taking this opportunity because nobody else was speaking up. I'm with First Nation Notchanaakdun as a council member, but I'm also doing this for my own personal interest because this is something I believe in. And I'm grateful that you guys are hosting this, and I hope we get a ton of people on here. Thank you for putting this on.
It's so nice to hear your voice tonight.
This is Lenore Morris, and I am also curious. Mining's a big thing in the Yukon, and I'd love to hear that it can be done responsibly.
Lenore, nice to see you as well.
Neil Hartling here. I'm interested in hearing what I can learn, and I think it's work like this that has brought the these higher standards in exploration and mining that we have today, and I think it's an important goal to continue and moving target to continue to improve.
And Neil, and thanks as well to everyone who's introduced themselves in the chat so far. Well, it's 4 minutes past. I can see people are still joining. Randy and Kate and Adele, do you maybe want to message on the chat? I'm thinking maybe we wait another 2 minutes till 5 past, given the number of people who are joining. Just wanted to make sure that works for the three of you.
Hi, it's Liz Hanson, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the discussion this evening, as this is vitally important for the future of the Yukon that we get this right. It's an obligation that was put forward as part of getting the devolution transfer agreement, that we have new modern mining legislation that reflects the 21st century. So I sure hope that we're going to do this in a good way.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's a great point for us to begin this evening. So thank you everyone who's joined so far. It's 5 minutes past, so I think let's get this kicked off, and we'll hopefully have a few more people joining us over the next few minutes. I'd like to open tonight with a land acknowledgement. I am speaking to you this evening from Whitehorse, the traditional territory of the Ta'an Council, and the this is very embarrassing. I just messed up my yeah, I know that. I just froze for a minute. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here from the traditional territory of the Ta'an Council and the Quartz First Nation. I've been really honored to have been welcomed here on a number of occasions, and living in Whitehorse is a privilege. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge the people who are calling in from across the Yukon from different traditional territories, and I'm very grateful for you being here this evening. I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Chris Ryder. I'm the Executive Director of CPAWS Yukon, and I'll tell you a little bit about the organization. As an organization, we advocate for the Yukon's precious land, water, and wildlife. Broadly speaking, we work to support First Nations in the Yukon to achieve their goals to protect their traditional territory. Many of you may know the work that our organization has done over many years on the Peel watershed, and we're really privileged to be able to continue that work and to be supporting First Nations on a number of other projects around the Yukon. I want to note how grateful I am for the trust that has been put into us, and that trust is something that we take incredibly seriously. In short, we work for wild spaces, and it's something we always try to do in a really good way. So we're here tonight to outline CPAWS Yukon's vision for the future of the Yukon. What we want to see is a Yukon where the needs of nature and community health are put to the forefront of all decision-making processes. It's an opportunity for us to think about what are the things that we value most about the place that we call home. And we're going to share with you our vision of the future of mining. And we're going to do that through the recommendations that we are making to the mineral development strategy. Now, I'm just incredibly proud of the recommendations that we're going to be putting forward tonight. Some of them are common sense. They're practical steps that can be implemented immediately. And some of them are more big picture visionary statements that really help us set a framework for how we want to be and how we want to work in this wonderful territory. I think that the process that we're going through with the mineral development strategy right now is incredibly timely. COVID-19 has forced us to step back and consider what it is that we value in the world. And one of the things that I've been really hardened by over the last few months, despite all of the challenges, the difficulties, and honestly the tragedy that we've seen throughout the world, one of the things that we have really witnessed is people valuing the role of nature and wilderness, and people taking the time to reconnect with the land around us. And I think that's an incredibly timely and important message for us all. So there's also, as part of this, a conversation about what a just recovery from COVID-19 might look like. And we really see that the mineral development strategy is an opportunity for us to actually put forward a vision for what at least part of that might be. And so now I'm going to take a moment to introduce the speakers for tonight. As mentioned, my name is Chris Ryder. I am going to be your host for the evening. But we also have three main speakers. Randy is the Conservation Manager for CPAWS Yukon. She's been with us since 2017, and she has a master's degree in urban and regional planning. Before joining CPAWS, she worked as a land use planner and contributed to a variety of projects, including official community plans, regional plans, and green network plans. Randy comes to the Yukon from Alberta and has brought with us a really great sense of pragmatism, and is often the person that calms us all down when we start to get a little bit too excited about things that are going on. I'd also like to introduce to you Dr. Kate Novak. Kate has a PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge. And before moving to the Yukon, she researched the behavior and conservation of African monkeys and elephants in Tanzania and South Africa. Kate has been published by National Geographic and many other publications throughout North America and the world. And so we're very grateful to have her here this evening as part of the team. She joined CPAWS earlier this year to help us bridge science and advocacy. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Adil Dervesh. Adil has a degree in biological science and a graduate certificate in environmental visual communications. Adil is our communications coordinator. And if you ever read our newsletter, followed us online, seen any of our Facebook or Twitter posts, you've seen Adil's work. He is an incredible advocate for the Yukon's wilderness. And so now before I hand it over, I'll just do a quick little bit of housekeeping. A note that once again, this presentation this evening is being recorded. As we go through, if you have any questions, I encourage you to send them to me as a direct message. So you'll be able to find my name in the chat and send that through to me. What I'll do is I'll collate any of those questions. And at the end, we'll do a question and answer, and we'll try and make sure we can get through as many of your questions as possible. And so with that, hopefully you've had a chance to have a quick look at the agenda, which is on your screen. I will pass it over to Randy, who's going to be opening the presentation. So thank you, and once again, welcome to tonight's proceedings.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. It's really great to see so many people tuned in tonight. And because we're sitting at that window of opportunity to reshape mining in the Yukon that Chris spoke to. There's a chance to make it more responsible, make it work for everyone, and really make sure the opportunity and the benefits that do come from mining aren't compromising the sustainability and health of our environment and communities. Oh, and I'm not doing a very good job of advancing slides and talking at the same time. There we go. And so this window of opportunity to reshape mining is the mineral development strategy. You might have received one of these flyers in the mail that you can see on the slide. And the name of the strategy makes it sound a little bit like it's an industry-focused technical plan to develop more minerals in the Yukon, but that's not really what it is. Like we've said, it's a chance for that more responsible mining regime and for people to shape what that looks like in the Yukon. So more specifically, the mineral development strategy, once it's complete, it's going to be a guide to mining in the Yukon and how it's managed. Everything from staking, exploration, mine operation, closure, reclamation. And I think there's room for positive change with all of those activities. And this strategy is being created by an independent 3-person panel. And their role is really to listen to First Nations, transboundary Indigenous groups, different Yukon government departments, organizations like us, other organizations, industry, Yukoners, you name it. There's a whole bunch of folks involved. And listen to people for what modern responsible mining should look like in the Yukon. And Adil later on is going to talk a little bit more about how you can provide input to this strategy. So the panel is going to take all that input to create a strategy, a draft strategy. And if you look on the figure at the bottom, right now we're in that light blue engagement phase. And we haven't seen a deadline put out yet for when that engagement phase will end. Things are very in flux with COVID, but we've heard possibly the end of July. So you can stay tuned for that. Once the panel develops that draft strategy, those draft recommendations, there'll be another chance for people to comment on it. And then the panel is going to create the final strategy, and that's expected in early 2021. And it's at that point that they'll submit it to both Yukon government and Yukon First Nations for it to be considered and then acted on. And so in many cases, the way that our mining legislation and policy framework is set up, it's really going to be up to Yukon government to get that ball rolling on taking action. And I think that's where you come in. You know, the more people that are involved with creating the strategy, the more perspectives and voices. First, we're going to get a stronger strategy. And then second, if people demonstrate that they're really invested in this path towards more responsible mining, it's much more likely that the strategy won't just sit on a shelf. You know, it'll be more likely and sooner that Yukon government will get that ball rolling on taking action. And then work with First Nations to co-implement the vision and actions that could come from this strategy. And This process is happening right now because it's one of the action items to come out of something called the Mining Memorandum of Understanding. And that's an agreement that was signed in early 2017 by Yukon government and the 11 First Nations in the Yukon with final agreements. I obviously haven't been a part of those discussions. I don't know how well the whole process is working, but according to the Yukon government website, this mining MOU is intended to do a couple of things. Improve the management of mineral resources in the Yukon and ensure our mining regime reflects First Nations values, interests, and addresses their issues. And finally, that mining respects environmental stewardship. And so yes, some of these statements are pretty general, but I do think it sets a fairly high standard that the final mineral development strategy can be held to. Over the years, there's been positive changes in the way mining is managed and conducted. Certainly there have, but I'm going to touch on a few stories that show there's still some work to do before we reach that standard set here. So it's easy to point to the Faro mine environmental disaster, but that was approved quite a long time ago, I believe in the 60s. So I'm going to start with a more recent example of the Mount Nansen mine, which was abandoned by BYG Natural Resources in 1999. This was a gold and silver mine west of Carmacks, and mine production started in 1996. It was quickly suspended about a year later because of violation of the water license. The company was given some time to mitigate the issue, and they got quickly back on track. Almost as quickly, their license was suspended again for a repeated violation. And these were issues that posed real threats to people in the environment, including a failure to treat arsenic in a tailings pond and for improperly designing, well, both improperly designing and then haphazardly constructing a tailings dam and surrounding ditches. So I said BYG, they abandoned the mine after it was shut down and declared bankruptcy in 2004. And so this happened in the 90s, but in his 2017 ruling, Justice Ron Vail pointed out, that the BYG disaster could happen again, and the Yukon government, with approximate revenues of just over $1 billion, will be liable for the cost of the environmental cleanup. So this case should be a wake-up call. And so one of the things that he's pointing to is that responsibility for mining and the environment was passed from the federal government to the territory in 2003. And so it's now the territory that's on the hook when a company walks away from a mine cleanup. And just this past February, in a ruling related to Mount Nansen, Justice Vail pointed out that the original costs of remediation were estimated at $4 to $8 million. They quickly climbed to, 23 million by 2007. The news continues to get worse. The justice here says he's now advised by counsel that Canada has incurred costs of $40 million to date, and a further $110 million is estimated to complete the remediation. Given the gross underestimation of remediation costs, that $4 million to $150, I have little faith that the final tally for the taxpayer will be $150 million. So our system failed us. Any of the benefits of that mine have just been sort of enormously overshadowed by those environmental costs and that remaining financial burden that society faces. That's money that could have been better spent on any number of things. So, yes, we can maybe make the argument that things have changed since the 90s, that we have a much more modern mining regime now that will prevent this from happening again. You might have guessed, that takes me to the Wolverine mine, a zinc-lead silver mine formerly owned by Yukon Zinc, a company that was ordered into receivership in 2019 because of their failure to properly manage their mine site. And they went into bankruptcy a month after that. This mine started operation fairly recently in 2011. It operated until 2015 and entered temporary closure, or it was called temporary at the time, when metal prices fell. And Yukon Zinc let the mine flood while it was in temporary closure. Normally that water would have been pumped out, and the mine flooded to the top by June of 2017. The tailings pond also started to quickly fill with contaminated water. So because of this, Yukon government was forced to step in and build a water treatment plant. And so this is a mine that lost money every year it operated. It never contributed royalties to the territory. It shorted the territory $25 million in security that will be required at a minimum to remediate the site. And so, yes, there are hundreds of jobs attached to that mine, but surely we can strike a better balance than this. I should mention that the Yukon Conservation Society has a really excellent presentation available online about abandoned mines and the financial picture related to them. We'll provide a link to that in our follow-up email to this webinar. And I should mention we have Louis Rifkind and Sebastian Jones on the line with us, and they're available for the Q&A if you have any questions that might fall a little bit more into their ballpark. So during the court case to try and get security from Yukon Zinc, Yukon government's lawyers said that the territory had tried to proactively manage this mine and the risk that went with it. The judge, Susan Duncan, wasn't very sympathetic to that argument and said, you know, Yukon may want to consider being more proactive earlier, seeking more security, inspecting and issuing directions more often, especially when it's clear a mine is in financial difficulties, and by assessing risks and conditions early and often. So yes, you could say Wolverine Mine was approved in 2007. It was a different time, but we've really only now just had the chance to figure out what went wrong. And we haven't had that much time to make changes to make sure it doesn't happen again. You know, this decision on security came out this month, and it was only last year that an audit by the firm PricewaterhouseCoopers came out. And that was an audit that they conducted for Yukon government to try and figure out what went wrong with how the territory managed the mine, including its decisions about financial security for remediation. And in that audit found that by the summer of 2016, the government already knew that Yukon Zinc likely wouldn't have been able to pay additional security. And that would have been a good point to reject another extension and deem the company out of compliance. And this would have reduced both the environmental and financial risk that we face today. That audit also found gaps in Yukon's legislative and policy framework. One major gap is the Yukon currently doesn't have the tools to assess a company's financial risk or sensitivity to metal prices before they hand out a mining license. And so to do that, that will take legislative change, but it will help stop these financially precarious projects from going forward. And so the point of these examples is really, it's not so much the irresponsible things that the companies did. It's really the failure of the territory's regulatory framework to put a stop to it. Because if we want a different outcome, we need to design a different system. And so the mineral development strategy is a chance to do that. So that brings me to our recommendations. There are 7 steps for more responsible mining in the Yukon. Our approach in coming up with these was thinking about what it would take for mining to be truly sustainable in the territory. You know, how can Yukoners enjoy the benefits that do come from responsible mining, but then generations down the road, we can look back and see we've also been able to hold the things that people really value about. Of course, with our mandate, we focused on wildlife and wilderness and the ways of life that are attached to both. So this is to say, you know, we offer these recommendations because we believe they'll lead to stronger and more responsible mining in the Yukon. But these recommendations don't touch on every issue. And that's really the value of having a variety of voices and perspectives contributing to this strategy. Because maybe you have other concerns on your mind. Community, health and safety, social justice, worker safety, culture and heritage, mining in municipalities, boom bust cycles of mining, the list kind of goes on. And again, there's that high bar that the strategy has to be held to, not just for environmental stewardship, but also, you know, meeting First Nation interests, values, and rights, including co-management. And with that, I'm just going to jump right into our first recommendation. So the first key step, and I would say the most important recommendation that could come out of the Mineral Development Strategy, is to update Yukon's mining legislation, the Quartz Mining Act and the Placer Mining Act. You know, there's other legislation that applies to mining, of course, but these are the main ones. And when I say update, what I mean is develop successor legislation. This is modern replacement legislation. It doesn't have to look completely different. It certainly needs an overhaul. You know, the legislation we have right now is a product of the early 1900s, with a few tweaks here and there. But the scale of mining and its impacts back then looked a lot different than they do today, of course. And, you know, these acts don't necessarily reflect the values that people and communities hold today. And before I go forward, though, I'm just going to do a really quick 101 on the difference between placer mining and quartz mining, just in case there's a few folks in the room who aren't familiar, just so this all makes sense. So placer mining refers to mining that takes place in, you know, gravel and sand deposits and kind of that loose material. Miners are looking for gold nuggets. So this type of mining, by its very nature, impacts stream beds. And when people think of placer mining, they often think of this guy on the license plate with, you know, gold pan in hand. But really, the operations of today can look a lot different. You know, there's heavy equipment, and there's just the sheer number of operating placer mines are now capable of transforming entire watersheds. This is a Google Earth image of the Indian River watershed, looking down at the Indian River, and those light, sort of sandy colored areas have been disturbed by placer mining. And so I've zoomed in here, and you can see impacts like water courses have been shifted, wetlands and riparian habitat lost. In this example, many of these are peat wetlands that take thousands of years to form, and just they can't be restored. This also means loss of fish habitat, warmer water because you've lost that vegetation shade, losing the filtration that comes with riparian vegetation, you know, different nutrient cycling, carbon, it goes on. And you can also see the access that goes along with mining, those roads and trails that are running across that slide, meaning more people can come into an area and, you know, disturb wildlife like caribou, and, you know, it brings a lot of additional hunting pressure as well. Sebastian from Yukon Conservation Society has a great presentation on wetlands, and I'm glad we have him on the call if you have any questions about mining and wetlands. Not to put him on the spot, but I guess I have. This is all to say that the Placer Mining Act hasn't really been able to keep pace with the transformation that this kind of mining can bring. Now, I think this has really been highlighted recently. Trondikwichen First Nation asked the Water Board to hold a public hearing on mining and undisturbed wetlands in the Indian River watershed. And that public hearing was scheduled for this spring and should now be held this fall if it can go forward. Moving on to quartz mining, this is a picture of Victoria Gold's Eagle Gold mine. And when I say quartz mining, it's a general term that means hard rock mining. It doesn't mean mining for the mineral quartz necessarily. And like the name suggests, this type of mining takes place in bedrock. You know, it has obviously a much different footprint than placer mining. You know, the footprints of these mines are much larger. And you could say maybe per mine, there's more environmental risk than a placer mine when you think of the tailing stacks or ponds and the contaminants that they could contain. You can think back to the Mount Nansen and Wolverine mine examples I gave and the enormous cost of cleaning. So at any given time, the territory usually has a few hard rock mines operating and, you know, over 100 placer mines. So each has different impacts, and that's why we have legislation tailored to each type of mining. Okay, back to our recommendation to develop successor legislation. And I think that's really what's needed to, you know, give it a good overhaul rather than just sort of fiddling around the edges. Because that's really what it's going to take for these acts to align with, you know, the final agreements, Yukon's modern treaties, the rights of unsettled First Nations, land use planning processes, and, you know, other modern government legislation and regulations. And Yukon seems like Yukon's mining legislation keeps butting up against these rights and governance arrangements, often in a way that doesn't align. And in many cases, we're seeing this play out in the court system. So this just doesn't provide certainty for anyone. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what specific changes are needed. I think maybe that could come up in the Q&A later. But also because what we can hope for from the mineral development strategy is a recommendation that Yukon government commit to co-creating new mining legislation with First Nations. And we're hoping, and I would even say expecting, that to come out of this strategy. And then actually developing that legislation is something that would happen after the strategy and take a few years. I'll run through a short but incomplete list, but that would be the chance to do things like modernize our quartz and placer mining royalties. It can make it possible for Yukon government to turn down those kind of financially perilous mining companies. We could allow mining inspectors to issue tickets instead of having to go to court all the time. When operators don't pay their fines, there could be real consequences. We could place some boundaries on the free entry system so it aligns with land use planning and First Nation co-management of natural resources. But most importantly, it's the architecture of the Quartz Mining Act and the Placer Mining Act that needs to change. And to explain what I mean, I'll just give an example here. I've pulled up sections from the Quartz Mining Act and the Forest Resources Act. The Forest Resources Act is a much more modern piece of legislation. It was developed after devolution, successor legislation. And there's really fundamental differences between these two acts. And so the Quartz Mining Act is a fairly old school piece of legislation. The act itself doesn't actually include a purpose like acts now today do. But pulling from the mining recorder's Hard Rock Guidebook, it says that the purpose of the Quartz Mining Act is to encourage prospecting, exploration, staking, and development of mineral resources. So it's straightforward, but it's pretty narrow, especially when you compare it to the Forest Resources Act. Looking at the purpose of this act is the sustainable use of forest resources for the benefit of current and future generations, ensuring, interests of all users are considered with the need to promote the health of forests. And then if you look at the preamble of that act, there's language that's taken directly from the final agreements that recognizing that the use of forest resources should enhance beneficial change while not undermining ecological and social systems that Yukon communities and society depends on. So the point is not that it's enough to just include language like this. The point is that developing successor legislation provides a modern framework or modern architecture that can align with Yukon's commitments to things like the final agreements and the rights of unsettled First Nations. But I'd say if there's one recommendation to remember from tonight and to ask for from the mineral development strategy, I would say it's this one. This brings me to our second recommendation. Have a land use plan in place before making decisions about transformative mining projects. And so just to be clear when I say that, I don't mean finish land use planning across the entire territory before making decisions or before any development can go forward. What I mean is that when a major development is proposed before the territory reviews or approves it, have a land use plan in place first to guide that project review. Because the alternative to this is just relying on project assessment, looking at a project one by one. And it's typically how things are done. And this is where an agency will look at a proposed project and decide if it should go forward or not, and if it does go forward, what conditions are attached to it. I'll get into the shortcomings of that approach in a few slides. And in Yukon, project assessment is done by the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board. I'm just going to say YESAB moving forward. So this recommendation, I know it's a bit of there's a lot to unpack here. Maybe first, what do we mean by transformative projects? I think it depends on the project, and I think it depends where the project is proposed. But generally, you can think of a project that if it went forward, could lead to those lasting transformative changes on a landscape. Maybe it increases human access, maybe it opens up an undeveloped watershed. You know, that's something that could happen with a hard rock mine or a major mining road. You can also think of areas where the amount of placer mining is starting to transform the landscape, like in the Indian River watershed. And then I guess we'll unpack land use planning next. If you're not familiar with it, it's a process for laying out a broad vision for the land and settling those big questions around development, like mines and roads. It provides that guidance for environmental review of projects. Right now, there's 2 completed regional plans in the Yukon, the North Yukon and the Peel watershed, and work on the Dawson land use plan is currently underway. So that's the general idea. Before I move on, I know there's a lot to this recommendation. There's a lot of nuance, and it's something that would be defined and guided by a policy that's co-created by First Nations and Yukon government. And there's 2 major reasons that we're putting this recommendation forward. And the first is that project-specific environmental review isn't really well equipped to evaluate cumulative effects. And cumulative effects are changes to the environment that result from that sum of human activity and natural change. And so to evaluate cumulative effects and the impact that they could have on a landscape or wildlife, you need to tally the past, current and, future scenarios of development, and also think about natural changes like climate change. And often the information to do that isn't readily available, especially in that short time span for environmental review. And even more than that, it's out of scope for YESEB to look at future development that proposed development could bring. It doesn't do that type of modeling. So when a mining road goes in, the review doesn't look at that kind of domino effect of development that could happen. Other roads and trails, other mines that roads tend to bring. And so because we don't have that good baseline information, basic things like wildlife numbers or where their preferred habitat is, by the time this domino development goes forward, we don't have a baseline to compare it to. We haven't set any limits on development. And that's how you start losing things sort of bit by bit across the territory. Sometimes it's called shifting baseline syndrome. And so the second reason we've put this recommendation forward is that, deciding whether or not to transform a landscape, if a transformative project should go forward, whether that's a good or a bad thing, whether it's in the public interest, that's a big question of values. And that's not something that's in scope for YESEB or any environmental review process. The purpose of environmental review is to mitigate impacts. It's not to determine whether a project fits with, to determine a vision for a landscape. That's the role of land use planning. So land use planning is that much more comprehensive process. It sets out a vision. So we have a goal to work towards. It sets a framework that you can use for future environmental assessment. Land use planning gives us a really good understanding of a landscape, especially how much development it can withstand or not, what areas should be protected because they're especially sensitive. And even YESEB has said, this was from a recent review of the exploration road to the Tiger deposit. YESEB assessment does not and cannot address the matter of whether a project proposes an appropriate use of land. Of course, YESEB can't do that. And the quote on the left and the headline are both talking about that proposed road into the Tiger deposit. And you can see these sort of conflicting values and these big questions that we're left with and that need to be sorted out. On the right, you have the exploration company saying, our project is unsustainable without a road. And then you have others, including Yukon Environment, saying the road is unsustainable for this undisturbed wilderness area. This is just an example of conflicts that pop up all the time and that go unresolved, that aren't addressed by environmental review, even though these types of projects tend to be approved. And as a final example of the different outcomes that environmental review and land use planning can lead to. I just wanted to speak about the Wernicke Winter Road project. Some of you might remember this. It was proposed in 2007 by Cache Minerals to support their uranium exploration in the Peel watershed. It was a 178 kilometer winter road. You can see it there on the screen, kind of a reddish orange color. And it would have run alongside the Wind River. When it was proposed, planning in the Peel was, at the beginning stages. There was concern from the Planning Commission, concern or even outcry, I would say, maybe from the public, that this road was even being considered before the plan had had a chance to set out, where development should go and what areas should be protected. But despite that concern, the road was reviewed and ultimately approved. Now, apparently, and I would say fortunately, the project was not financially viable and it didn't go ahead. If it had, this iconic shot from Peter Mather of the Wind River, I think could look quite different. This is an area that's now set to be one of Yukon's major protected areas, beloved by many. It's hard to imagine that different future for it that could have happened if we just gone down that road of just relying on that fairly short environmental review process. And it just shows these really radically different conclusions you can reach through environmental review, which is, quick, versus a really comprehensive land use planning process. Skipped ahead. So this is a recommendation that could provide, I would say, a lot of clarity, because sort of ad hoc land use planning is sort of happening now on a bit of a piecemeal basis, and I think it's catching proponents by surprise. The road to the Tiger deposit is sort of an obvious example. The road was approved, but it can't go ahead until a sub-regional plan, the Beaver River Watershed Sub-Regional Plan, has been completed. There's a situation in the Indian River Watershed, again, where Trundiquichin First Nation has called for that public hearing on mining in undisturbed wetlands. I think it's just another example showing that there's pushback on the so-called sufficiency of environmental review. And so besides a full regional plan, which, they do take years to complete, there are a few other options. You can do, sub-regional planning under the final agreements. It's similar to regional plan for smaller area. There's a mouthful of regional strategic environmental assessment, using that and then setting cautious limits on development. I'm not gonna have a lot of time. I'm not gonna get into these. If you're curious, you can read our full submission on our website. I'll just mention, both of these can be a significant drain on capacity and resources. They don't all answer all the questions that a regional plan can, and they can take a significant amount of time. So I'll move on to our third step, to pause mineral staking during land use planning. And to be clear, what we're recommending here is that when a land use planning process gets going, to put mineral staking on hold for that region. So staking mineral claims is when someone goes out and quite literally stakes an area of land, and with that, they have exclusive rights to develop those minerals. And when this happens while land use planning is going on, it really undermines the process. Pun not intended, but I will take it. As the number of claims rises, your options for the plan get narrower, and your costs for other ways of using the land rise, especially when our mining acts, they really provide a very clear pathway from staking to mine development. When this happens, ecologically and culturally important areas can be staked and mined before they can be protected through the land use plan. And Chapter 11 of the final agreements, it talks about the purpose of land use planning is to prevent land use conflicts. And if staking moves forward, it really doesn't align with that. And even when areas are protected during planning, mining claims remain on the landscape because of the way our current legislation works. In the Peel, for example, I'm sure many people are familiar with this. Planning started in 2004, but it took 6 years for there to be a staking withdrawal, despite a lot of voices calling for it to be done earlier. And in that 6-year period, claims rose from about 1,500 to 8,500. And the result, as the Yukon News put it, the courts haven't seen the last of the appeal. You know, some of these claims holders may try to develop their claims, putting these future protected areas at risk in the appeal. There's been recent Class 1 notices pop up of mining exploration in some of these future protected areas. And then other claims holders are demanding compensation for these claims. So perhaps compensation is fair in some cases, but it's hard to be sympathetic when people staked claims after a planning process started. You know, so placing that temporary withdrawal and staking, that's something that would allow all values to be equally considered, making space for those visions and values. And I think it's something that would lead to plans that are right for the land and communities. And it's common planning practice to hit that pause button as a general principle. This is something that bears out in a lot of different cases. It's not always just applied to mining. In urban areas, municipalities will put a holding designation on a parcel if they feel they need more time to do studies or extend infrastructure before development happens. For regional plans in the prairies where I've worked, mining isn't as prevalent, but often agricultural subdivision will be put on hold during planning just to give that space to develop the plan. You know, recognizing that when we're developing a plan, it's not just for the people of today, but it's really for generations down the road. And so putting staking on hold is really the best way to get that solid footing. The final recommendation I'm going to talk about before I pass it over to you, Kate, is for Yukon government to better separate mining promotion, regulation, and enforcement. The way Energy, Mines, and Resources is currently set up, the department, it's really part regulator and part promoter. If you go to the Mineral Resources Branch website, you look and it says that the branch is responsible for regulating exploration and mining and encouraging its development. EMR also houses the Compliance Monitoring and Inspections Branch, so responsible for enforcement. And so you can see how the mandate of that department can become a little muddled when encouraging development, approving mining projects, determining if mines are in compliance with their license, deciding what to do about it, all fall under the same department. And this is the separation of promotion, regulation, and enforcement, I would say, is a general principle for any industry. Here we're talking about mining because of the mineral development strategy, but this is certainly something that could be applied to agriculture, tourism, oil and gas, forestry, you name it. And in making these recommendations, you know, we're really echoing what's been said in other places, including the recommendations of the Auditor General in British Columbia following the Mount Poly mining disaster. As a reminder, this is when years worth of mining waste spilled into Poly Lake from Imperial Metals copper mine. And following the spill, the Auditor General in British Columbia took a really close look at the way mining was regulated in the province. And they found that a poorly engineered and constructed dam was the immediate cause of that spill, but it was really the regulatory structure of the government that was the root cause. And so you can think back to some of the examples I gave earlier, you know, Nansen and Wolverine. You know, yes, some mining companies acted poorly, but the government also failed in curtailing that behavior. So in BC, following this spill, the Auditor General's report really pointed to the importance of having that clear mandate. They found that the Ministry of Energy and Mines' role to promote mining development is diametrically opposed to compliance and enforcement. This framework of having both activities within the ministry creates an irreconcilable conflict. It's because compliance and enforcement is that last line of defense against environmental degradation. Business as usual can't continue. And we're seeing something similar here, you know, considering the stakes, you know, the financial risk and the environmental risk and the health risk if the mine is in the wrong place. Regulators and people in enforcement really need that clear mandate. They need to be insulated from political interference. And Yukon government needs to take a whole of government approach when approving mining projects because there's a lot of values at play. So it's essential that regulators have that clear mandate to prioritize the environment and communities. And so when you're dealing with that combination of three different activities, promotion, regulation, and enforcement, there's different ways to accomplish that separation. Admittedly, we're putting forward a few key ideas here. The first would be to move mining project approval from Energy, Mines, and Resources to the Development Assessment branch. That would allow project approval to be looked at through the lens of sort of that whole of government approach. And then making that branch arm's length, providing that insulation so people have that clear mandate and can act on it without interference. Second recommendation would be to move mining enforcement, the compliance monitoring and inspections, to an independent agency. Again, making sure there's that insulation. And then improving transparency, publicly report the result of mining compliance and enforcement activities. So now I'm going to shift things over to Kate. She's going to speak to recommendations that really get to that interplay between the environment, communities, and economic development. And with her background in conservation and anthropology, I think she is a good person to do that.
Thanks, Brandy, and thanks everyone for your attention. So I'm going to walk you through our recommendations 5 through 7. And our 5th recommendation has to do with the way we fulfill our commitments to biodiversity and climate action and how we stay on track those. Our values are going to be reflected in the fulfillment of these commitments. And they are being made at different scales: international, national, and territorial. At the international level, we have the Paris Agreement, which Canada and 194 other signatories signed in 2016, committing us to keeping global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. There are also the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which can be thought of as a blueprint for a better world by 2030. There are national level commitments. Canada has committed to protecting 25% of land and water by 2025 and 30% by 2030. There's also Canada's Species at Risk Act, or SARA, put in place to prevent wildlife species from disappearing. And in the cases where species are already under threat, providing for their recovery. At the territorial level, the Yukon is committed to protecting vulnerable species and ecosystems. Randy mentioned wetlands. There's also, of course, high alpine in the Yukon, also vulnerable, and to addressing the climate emergency. That emergency was declared in late 2019 and early 2020 by the 14 Yukon First Nations, by the Assembly of First Nations, by the Council of First Nations, and also by the Yukon government. One of the outputs of that declaration was Our Clean Future, which is a Yukon strategy for climate change, energy, and a greener economy. These commitments won't be met without corporate responsibility and accountability, and without strong direction and leadership from the Yukon government. And if we take a look at a page inside Our Clean Future, we can find mining specific actions. For example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as increasing the government of Yukon's participation in initiatives at the intergovernmental level related to the resiliency of mines, to low carbon mining, as well as innovation, which might include urban mining of our electronic waste, using lower impact technologies, as well as adapting to climate change. In thinking about our commitments, we must also consider our neighbors with whom we share water, as well as salmon. This is because contamination from mines can flow across international boundaries, violating the Canada-US Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, which states that waters flowing across the boundary shall not be polluted on either side to the injury of health or property on the other. So our Yukon River flows from BC through the Yukon and Alaska and empties into the Bering Sea. But salmon such as Chinook swim upriver, and the red dots that you're seeing on the screen show the movement of Chinook and the associated dates of that movement. And this is from the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee. So these transboundary risks, on the next slide, Randy, thanks. These transboundary risks have been discussed in various publications as well as in the media. Here's a letter that was published in Science a couple of months ago by a group of scientists flagging some of those risks. Here's a quote from that letter. It says that upstream Canadian mines threaten downstream economies, waters, and ways of life, just as the United States is currently weakening its own environmental regulations. So rather than a race to the bottom, can we honor our mutual obligations and collaborate on, where appropriate, binational environmental reviews that are founded on independent and transparent and peer-reviewed science? And this is a map showing all of the transboundary caribou herds that we share with the Northwest Territories, with Alaska, and with British Columbia. So of course, the land animals also must be considered. So that brings me to our sixth recommendation, which is the mitigation hierarchy. We are calling it 4 steps for the land. And this hierarchy is meant to help reduce environmental negatives, but it also helps reduce the chance of getting caught by surprise. So it consists of 4 steps for the land: avoiding harm, minimizing harm, restoring what has been damaged, and as a last resort, offsetting what has been lost. And this framework may be adopted by the Yukon's wetland policy, which is something that Sebastian can speak to. But again, the emphasis really must be on those first 2 steps, avoid and minimize. This is a cross-sector guide to using the mitigation hierarchy. It's readily available. And the takeaway point again is that our targets and our commitments are not going to be met if we're paying and offsetting our way out. So if I just walk you through these 4 steps and give you some examples. Avoidance starts early, when adjustments to the project site and the location of the infrastructure are still feasible and can still be made. That might mean rerouting a road. It might mean working only in the winter to avoid the nesting seasons of specially protected species like peregrine falcons. Minimizing, meanwhile, really requires good data. It might entail controlling the movement of trucks or vehicles during the migration season of caribou. It might mean reducing noise and light coming from the mine site. It might mean using low impact technologies as well as renewable energy sources and protecting watercourses from contamination. Restoration, the 3rd step, will take place after the impacts have already occurred. And we have to keep in mind that full restoration or full reinstatement of a site is impossible. Restoration does require some planning. For example, we might need to preserve and store seeds or topsoil from the site with the intent of using that topsoil and seeds later in restoration. And finally, offsetting is going to take place off of the direct project site. So we need to make sure that if we do offset, that offset is permanent. Offsets come in 2 forms. There are restoration offsets, which entail remediating past damage elsewhere. And then there are averted low offsets. And that means protecting an area, again, a different area, from future degradation in the future. But obviously there are some problems with offsetting. The biodiversity values are never going to be identical across sites. So what might be lost in the project site cannot be fully offset elsewhere. The other problem is that if we're going to always be offsetting carbon without doing anything meaningful along the way to reduce the environmental harm or the carbon, we're going to never meet the targets that I discussed earlier, and we're probably going to end up with pretty high remediation costs. So I'm just going to mention one visionary effort that's taking place on behalf of restoration, and that is Ross River Dena Council's native plant nursery. This is something that is in development. Jody Inkster from the Dena Cho Environmental and Remediation consulting company says, we want to return our lands back to what they were. Right now we're left with these abandoned mine sites that we're trying to clean up for future generations. The important point here is that we need a clear vision for how sites are going to look after disturbance and restoration. And Yukon First Nations hold that Indigenous knowledge that can inform that vision, given that they have been on the land for thousands of years. So what can industry do? For one, industry can make sure that technologies are being used that minimize impacts. I'll say here that the global mining industry consumes about 400 terawatt hours of electricity per year. That's nearly as much as all of France. And yet renewable energy only accounts for 0.1% of total supply, and that's excluding large hydropower. There are examples of renewable energy sources being used. Here's the diamond mine in Northwest Territories with wind power, and a solar-powered gold mine in South Africa, both which are proving economical. Industry can also ensure that we have sufficient data collected to assess risks to people, land, water, and wildlife, facilitate monitoring that includes setting those ecological baselines, ideally with Indigenous knowledge holders, as well as measuring or keeping track of the before, during, and after, which Randy defined earlier as cumulative effects. And of course, providing sufficient financial assurances. So if we follow the science and scientifically established thresholds, we won't compromise our values. And we must also listen to traditional knowledge. Again, one reason for listening to traditional knowledge is that we do tend to suffer from shifting baseline syndrome. That means that every new generation perceives their environment as the norm, despite deterioration and degradation. So establishing those ecological baselines or how things were with Indigenous knowledge holders is a remedy to that syndrome, and it can really help plan restoration. So using the best available science, as someone who is relatively new to Canada and new to the Yukon, I will say that I'm really impressed generally that the policy direction in the Yukon and in Canada is guided by science and by that evidence base, and that the Yukon really appears to be very nimble and modern, and it can enact changes quickly even if systemic change can be difficult. And I know that the Yukon Science Strategy is considering providing some external expertise to the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board, or YESA, in its assessments. Okay, so our final recommendation is that we really understand the economics of mining in the Yukon before making decisions about those big transformative projects. We need to make sure that the legacy that mining is leaving is in fact positive. And that means looking at subsidization, remediation, loss of other high value land uses such as tourism, on the land learning, and just doing that basic financial accounting and reporting. That may mean, or is going to mean, going beyond gross domestic product, or GDP, which tells us how much money is being generated, but it's not going to tell us whether that money was helpful, who benefited from it, how much damage was done in the process, or even how much money ended up leaving the jurisdiction the moment it was generated. Another problem with GDP is that it actually includes costs to taxpayers, such as reclamation of abandoned mines. So that means that taxpayer-funded cleanup of sites like Faro, Wolverine show up as a net positive to the economy. So if we take just a moment to look at placer royalties, on the next slide, we learn that campground fees in the Yukon are actually larger than placer royalties. And that ties back into the first recommendation, and that was reforming legislation. So again, the Yukon gets more in campground fees than in placer mine royalties. Placer mine royalties in 2017 were about $27,000. And meanwhile, camping fees from non-residents alone were about $350,000, so about 10 times as much. So ultimately, perhaps we would wish to use the triple bottom line approach. It's a much more holistic cost-benefit analysis than, say, GDP. It recognizes that while economic criteria can be easily measured or quantified in dollars, social and environmental criteria are not as easily quantifiable. But we also know that economic growth cannot happen in isolation without benefits to social and environmental domains. So this triple bottom line views the economy as a subset of the society in which we live and want to live in, which is in turn a subset of our environment and its physical limits. So society and environment are not the result of the economy, but the economy is a product of and constrained by the social aspirations that we have and the physical limits of our living planet. And at no time in my lifetime has this message been more salient than during the COVID-19 era, raising issues like public safety, environmental safety, food security, and the fact that our health is connected to the health of other animals and the health of our environment, what's called One Health. So to sum up, our 7 recommendations for a stronger future in the Yukon are: 1, to update the mining legislation; 2, complete land use planning before approving projects that are transformative; 3, pausing mineral staking during land use planning; 4, separating the promotion, regulation, and enforcement of mining; 5, fulfilling our commitments to climate and biodiversity; 6, integrating those 4 steps for the land into project assessments; and 7, evaluating the economic costs and benefits of mining fully. So these are our 7 recommendations. You might very well go beyond these in your own submissions. We'll just take about 30 seconds to a minute to conduct a poll. We would really like to know which of these recommendations really resonates with you, is most important to you. And after we do the poll, Adil will walk us through the various engagement options. So thanks a lot for your attention. And I think you should be seeing the poll in front of you now. I'm going to hand it over to Adil, and he's going to tell us the results of the vote, or of the poll.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm just going to have like a last call for your votes in the next like 2 seconds. So if you haven't voted, and I will, okay, great. And I'll share the results. So yeah, it's actually kind of close across the board with about 60% agreeing, or most feeling like the first updating Quartz and placer axes resonates most with them, and then a close 56% with fully evaluating economic costs and benefits, and seems pretty even across the board for the rest of them. So that's kind of interesting. And yeah, like Kate mentioned, these are our recommendations, and you may feel to include these and more that you feel are important to you. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about how you can amplify your voice and share your vision further. And participating in the mineral development strategy is crucial because we have an opportunity to share our vision for what a healthy Yukon looks like. And this can seem like a lot. I know you guys have had a lot of information kind of thrown at you right now, but it's important because very rarely do we have the opportunity to participate in building a framework on something as important to the Yukon as mineral development. And this is our chance to ensure that the framework shares our values. And your comments can be as little or as much as you feel is necessary. You don't have to know all the technical terms or have decades of experience in mineral development. You're already an expert on your values, on your vision, and on what legacy you want to leave for future generations. And it's much easier to have that expertise reflected in a plan if it's built in on the ground floor, which is where we are right now in this public process. So, how to submit? Well, the panel has created a website where you can learn a little bit about how the panel was formed and the work that they've done up to this point. And most importantly, it's a platform where you can submit your thoughts. And you can submit in many ways, whatever is easiest for you. There's a survey that you can fill out. You can send an email. You can type up your thoughts in a Word document and send that. And you can even take out your smartphone and record a video of your message and send that. And if you're representing an organization, you can apply to do a virtual presentation as well. You can choose whatever method works best for you, and all of these are things that you can do from the comfort of your couch. Now, as Randy mentioned, the panel is planning on ending the comment period in late July before they compile all of their responses and draft a recommendation. So you have a few weeks to gather your thoughts before you submit. And once the draft recommendation is released, the public will once again have the opportunity to raise concerns. And then from there, the panel will create final recommendations and present those to Yukon First Nations and Yukon government. And it's essential that those final recommendations have your vision represented in them. And again, it's easier for your vision to be in those recommendations if they're put in now rather than later. And we want this to be as easy for you as possible as well. So we put together our recommendations on our website, along with in-depth explanations on all of them. And we've also included our full technical submission for you to read through if you're interested or if you're looking for some ideas. And the Yukon Conservation Society also has their recommendations to the strategy on their website, which will also include in a follow-up email along with a recording of this and along with all these slides. So you can have all the information readily available before you submit if you'd like. If you're finding yourself looking for more information, or if you come up with a question on the weekend that you haven't thought of right now, you're always welcome to send us an email or find us on social media and message us. We'll be happy to respond. And if you want to stay updated on the latest mineral development strategy news, you can sign up for our newsletter, and I'll keep you updated on all things mineral development and all the other campaigns that we work on as well. So hopefully that was clear, but we also have a question and answer period coming up right now. So if you have any more questions, just throw them in the chat to Chris, and we'll hopefully get to them. Thanks, and over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Adele. I really appreciate that clear outline. I hope that's helpful for everyone who's on the call. So at this point, I just want to welcome to the presentation Louis and Sebastian from the Yukon Conservation Society, who have both volunteered to be here to help any questions where their expertise might be more valuable than the team we have. For example, Lewis has forgotten more about mining than I think I will ever know. And Sebastian, with his experience up in Dawson, living in the wetlands there and amongst the placer mining community, has a lot of experience with the placer mining reviews. So Lewis is the mining analyst and Sebastian is the placer mining reviewer. So with that, I welcome everyone to send me their question. Again, just go into the chat box, find my name, Chris Ryder, and send me your question directly. If you can please do me a favor and either give me your name and if you have an affiliation, if you're representing an organization, so that I can share that. Or if you prefer me to keep it anonymous, just let me know and I won't mention your name. We welcome any comments or feedback as well. And if you'd like me to read out a comment, just let me know. So with that, I'm going to go to our first question. And this one is from Noel Sinclair. Noel says, what do we know about the scale and capacity of regulatory supervision of mining activities in the Yukon? How frequently are mining enterprises inspected by trained environmental monitoring investigators? To what extent do the federal and territorial governments rely upon the industry to police itself by voluntarily reporting regulatory non-compliance? And to what extent are we relying on the fox to look after the henhouse? So I'm going to suggest maybe Lewis, if you want to take that first question.
Certainly. I hope everyone can hear me. Good question, Noel, and I'm afraid I can't really provide an answer because a lot of it's unknown. We do know that EMR does inspect mine sites, but getting a hold of their mining inspection reports is tough. They're not posted online. In fact, I can't recall the last time I've actually seen one. We do have a better luck with water license reporting. Water contamination from mine sites is a big issue. And those are posted quite regularly on the Yukon Water Board website. It's often a condition of their water license. But the mere fact they post it doesn't necessarily mean anything comes of it. For example, the most recent big water discharge at the Victoria Gold Mine site, 43 million litres of water had to be pumped into the ground because they didn't have the capacity to deal with it in their pond. That report was posted on the Water Board website, and it was just by pure chance that a CPAWS employee, Anne Neese, happened to see it and draw it to everyone's attention. There was no publicity at all given about it. So inspections do occur, but whether any action results from it is debatable. Sorry, I couldn't be more clear.
Thanks, Lewis. And I wonder if anyone else would like to add something. Kate, maybe you can say a few words.
Sure. When it comes to enforcement, the Environmental Enforcement Division of Environment Canada has 2 officers in the Environmental Enforcement Division in Whitehorse who deal with enforcement surrounding any mining issues, but only those under the Fisheries Act and the Environmental Protection Act, typically related to holding and tailing ponds and so on. So wildlife enforcement typically only becomes involved if there are any migratory bird mortalities related to the tailing ponds, and that's enforced under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So that's what I can add in terms of enforcement capacity. But again, that's only 2 officers for all of the Yukon.
Thank you so much. So let's move on to the next, next statement. This one comes from Liz Hansen. who says, staking does not confer ownership. That has to be a key understanding and change to the mining law and the psychology of the Yukon. So thank you for that message, Kate. The next question I have is an anonymous one, which is relating to recommendation 4. Alberta has an independent agency for compliance and enforcement of the oil and gas industry. The Alberta Energy Regulator, or AER. It has notoriously become fully funded and run by the industry it purports to regulate. What mechanisms do you suggest to avoid this outcome? Sebastian, I wonder if you have something you'd like to say on that one. Try and spread this out.
Okay, I assume that's related to the recommendation that Randy suggested, that there'd be an arm's length agency to regulate mining in the Yukon. That's a tough one. It's definitely, things do move towards that direction, because obviously the people being regulated are the ones most interested in the outcomes. We do have mechanisms in the Yukon that they don't have in Alberta. Most significantly, we do have the final agreements, which give First Nation governments equal status to other governments. We also have boards and committees that come out of the final agreements, such as the Salmon Committee, such as YESAB, such as the Water Board, that have various levels of authority too. It will require careful design to make sure that an independent agency remains independent.
Thanks, Sebastian. And is there anyone else who'd be interested in saying a few things in response to this? Okay, no, so at this point, I don't have any more questions. So if anyone does have any questions, I would encourage you to ask them now. Again, just a note that, or just a reminder that to do that, you can go into the chat and just click on my name. Okay, we've got one statement that's come in. Okay, so this one comes from Justin Lempis. He's points to two issues. Activity creep, I should say. The progression over time of an activity that exacerbates impact far past the intent of assessment and loses the initial focus in the process. For example, a trail is installed with a clause about the need to reclaim it. At the end of the expiry of the approval, the trail is presented as an existing road. There is no effective tool for mapping activity creep other than poring over individual approvals and authorizations. And there's also activity stretch, where work plans are assessed for X quantum of work, which will cause X amount of land disturbance. YG will allow authorizations and approval holders to reclaim mid-project, thus a high factor of disturbance. For example, a project is assessed for 400,000 square cubic meters of trenching and the associated footprint of disturbance over 10 years. At year 3 and 7, YG recognizes reclamation of 300,000 cubic meters. By the time the project ends, the actual volume trenched is 1 million cubic meters and the disturbance is over double what was assessed. Reclamation as defined in the PMA and QMA and is implemented by YG is fundamentally flawed. Thank you for that one. And we've got a few more questions in here. from Gordon Gilgan. Is there a mining operation that can be used as a positive example of how it should be done? This is a question I've asked Lewis privately on a number of occasions. So I'm going to throw this one back to Lewis.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, there's no perfect mining operation out there. The one sort of example that we've occasionally used is the old Brewery Creek operation up mile 4 on the Dempster Highway. It wasn't perfect by any stretch, but it was a hard rock mine, operated for a few years, basically shut down. They started doing remediation, and even though it was a small hard rock mine, it did tend towards getting itself remediated and closed off. However, it was never properly sort of finalized, and now a new company has bought it and is starting to reopen it up again, thus undoing all the work and years that went into the remediation of the existing project. It should also be mentioned that while the mine was running back in the old days, it did have quite a few water contamination issues. Selenium was a terrible issue. But when it comes down to it, there is no perfect mining operation if you're concerned about environmental issues, because mining means basically destroying all the surface fauna and flora and digging big holes in the ground and bringing up rock and Lord knows what else, which can in turn further contaminate the environment. It's mining by its very nature is destructive, but some of the benefits that we get from mining, whether it's the minerals being extracted, the wealth being created, is considered by some to be an adequate trade-off for the environmental destruction that occurs. Sorry, no perfect answer.
Thanks so much, Lewis. With that, we'll move on to the next question, which is Bob Van Dyken is looking for thoughts and recommendations on First Nation Category B lands. First Nations ownership and control of the surface with mining rights available for the mining industry. I see we've got Anne Meese on the call, and Anne, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if this is something that you would like to tackle as an answer. Okay, we'll put that on pause.
Oh, sorry, I was talking and I didn't unmute it.
Perfect.
Okay, so yeah, he's correct. Category B land, the surface is owned by the First Nation. Full rights to whatever's on top, mainly forestry, but the subsurface is owned by the Yukon government. So when a mining project comes along, chances are that it's going to be taken over by the Yukon government because they have the subsurface rights, whereas the First Nation would likely just be in consultation mode. So yes, but if it's Category A land, it's different because the First Nation owns both surface and subsurface rights. I don't think that answered the question.
Well, let's see if Bob did that answer the question for you. Feel free to unmute yourself, Bob, at this point.
It does a little bit. I know this has been an issue in terms of the rights of the surface holder versus the right to mine of the subsurface holder, and the disturbance to the surface in conducting the mining, and whether the First Nation has any control or veto or things like that. One recommendation that has been floated is converting the Category B land to Category A land to get rid of this problem in its entirety and provide the certainty to the surface landowner.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't heard of that, but yeah, I don't know how doable that would be to turn it into Category A land, for one, because the Category B allotment is fairly large in comparison to Category A land. And once it's Category A land, it becomes Aboriginal titled. So Category B doesn't have that same protection that Category A has. So I don't know. I haven't heard of that. Sorry.
I see, Bob, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and?
Hi. Yes. Being in Northern Tachoni country, we have one of the biggest allotments of land here, and you know, the 3 First Nations together, we're impacted so heavily by the mining industry, and we see all these problems. You know, even for enforcement, we had known stories of wrongdoings by the mining company. We always kind of hoped that the regulators would get in there unbeknownst to the mine so we could catch them in the act, but there was nobody there to follow up. So the impact on our area, because we don't have full rights to all of the land, when we say we care for the land, we do, you know, all the way to subsurface. We care about that. Where we have B lands, we only can care for the land, and it doesn't seem like the government is looking after our interests. So it goes right back to the agreements. The best way they can honor the final agreements that took years to get into place, and now it's a constitutional thing, is to allow the land use planning to continue before all these. We've been asking for moratorium in our areas, and that's not happening yet. So, you know, that impacts all of us. How can you plan properly when you have to plan around everything? I really like everything I heard on the recommendations that and all the speakers. So I'm hopeful. Yeah, so it's a real big impact. And, you know, with this COVID pandemic that we're in, it's really impacted our First Nation, because as you all know, we like to gather together and talk. We find strength in that, and we're not allowed to. So, well, and we don't want to, because we want to keep our elders safe, our knowledge keepers. And so it's really impacting us. So we can't really get together, but what I heard here, I need to get everybody on board and listening in. So thank you. I hope I helped a little bit, but I just raised some more awareness of how it's really disheartening to the First Nations. I mean, like, look at the Peel Plan. I still have that vision that we turn it into the 8th natural wonder. You know, everyone's going to say, wow, look at those people. Somebody back then had a vision that this would be the only last surviving. Oh, I'm just getting excited here. I won't go, but I'm so grateful we came to the conclusion up in the Peel. There's some certainty, but you know, we still have a lot of work to do. So thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights there. We really appreciate it. So I've got one more comment, which I'll read out, and this one comes from Dave Lokes. Dave says, current legislation accords mining of both types priority status as a land use, not just a priority use, but a preemptive one. We butted heads with both industry and the Yukon government about this for the duration of the Peel land use planning process. Yukon government has never met a mine it didn't like, and that's of all stripes, Dave says. So I would urge CPAWS and the public to focus hard on legislative change and focus on access as the leading edge of environmental degradation. And I think that's that access point is a really good one. And if anyone hasn't seen it, CPAWS Yukon recently released a report on the impact of roads in their territory, and I would recommend everyone give that a read. A lot of work went into researching and writing that. So with that, that's the end of our Q&A. So thank you to everyone who provided both questions and comments. This has been really insightful for me. I've learned a lot from all of you. I want to thank our speakers, Kate, Randy, and Adil, and also Lewis and Sebastian for their insights. I'm actually I think we're quite lucky because Michael Pirlo has joined the presentation. Michael is working with the Mineral Development Strategy panel to do these consultations. And so in a moment, I'd like to invite him to say a few words. I say that to get you prepped, Michael, but before you do, I just want to sort of just close by saying thank you once again to everyone who's joined us tonight. Everything we've spoken about is not to say we think the mining industry is bad or that it shouldn't exist in the Yukon. This is about how do we actually have a future in this territory that works for everyone. And I really think that this is a process that gives us the opportunity to send that message. And so with that, I'd like to open the floor to Michael and welcome you to say anything that you think would be valuable to add about the process.
I'd like to start by expressing my deep gratitude to CPAWS for hosting this event and for everybody here who's on the call tonight. This process really is an opportunity to re-envision what the future of mineral development looks like for the territory, why we do this, how we do this, and the scope really is quite broad. The panel is taking its work very seriously. It is very much in a learning mode right now, and it really does want to hear the perspectives of Yukoners, diverse perspectives. It's true what I heard said earlier is that we're all experts in mineral development in a way because we know how we're affected by it. We can imagine what we'd like the future to look like. And so just I would like to encourage everybody, please get engaged, please have your say. We do have a lot of options and we really do want to hear what you have to say. So thank you everybody for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, Michael. And do you maybe just want to say a few words once again about how people can best participate?
Sure. The website, we have a lot of options on the website. So you can, if you want your submission to be anonymous, we have our online survey, and there are a lot of different categories that you can choose on the survey. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure survey. You can make written, audio, or video submissions to the panel. If you make written, audio, or video submissions, we'll put those up on our website so they become public documents. If you're representing an organization, you can apply to make a presentation to the panel. We have the toll-free line. If you or someone you know doesn't have internet, we invite you to phone the toll-free line and leave your comments there. We also have an online discussion tool that we're using where we're taking some challenging and controversial topics and allowing people to share the pros and cons of the various questions that are posed there. So there are some options there. We are currently in the process of asking Yukon First Nations and municipalities how they would like us to do the community engagement portion. Initially, the panel was planning to go to all Yukon communities. COVID restrictions has made that a little bit more difficult in terms of how many people are allowed to gather and travel restrictions that were in place. We don't know the dates yet that we'll be closing off the engagement process, because we're waiting to hear back from communities on what they feel will work best for them. But the suggestion to try get your responses in sooner rather than later is a good one, especially because it gets to the panel sooner and they can consider that in their thinking. We are working on what we're hearing document that has started to go live on the website. We'll be posting various chapters as we process some of the information we've received so far. And we will be evolving those documents as we hear different things. So I encourage you to check those out as they become live as well.
Thanks so much, Michael. We really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate you listening and engaging with our recommendations and what we've heard from the people who've been participating this evening. So with that, I think we can end the evening. I want to thank everyone once again for being here. Obviously, this is your Thursday evening, and so we're grateful that you chose to spend it with us and everyone else who's on this call tonight. So lastly, I welcome anyone who would like to send your comments or your feedback to us. You can do that via our Facebook page. You can email us at info@cpawsyukon.org, or if you prefer, you can send that directly to myself at crider@cpawsyukon.org. And we really would welcome your feedback, and particularly if there's anything that you feel like we've missed. Those are the kind of things that we really love to hear from everyone. So with that, I want to say thank you. And I wish everyone a really wonderful evening. And I hope you stay healthy and happy. And I wish everyone lots of success in participating in this process. I think it's really important. So thank you so much. And thank you once again to our speakers. Good night.